The winter wind howled across the Montana Territory like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of pine and frost. In these untamed lands of 1878, where mountains pierced the sky and forests concealed 1,000 secrets, two souls from different worlds would forge an unlikely bond. One, a fierce Crow warrior haunted by the ghosts of his past. The other, a young woman who had witnessed unspeakable horror, the sole survivor of a massacre that had claimed everyone she loved. This is a tale of survival against impossible odds, of courage found in the darkest moments, and of healing that comes when we least expect it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost painted the grasslands silver as Thomas Blackfeather rode the boundary of what the white settlers called Eagle Creek Valley. At 43 years old, his face was etched with the lines of a man who had witnessed the changing of an era, each crease a testament to battles fought and lost. The Crow warrior's obsidian eyes surveyed the landscape with practiced vigilance, seeing what others missed. A bent blade of grass, the disrupted pattern of dew, signs that told stories to those who knew how to read them. Thomas adjusted the Winchester rifle secured across his back, a weapon he had taken from a cavalry soldier during the Battle of Little Bighorn 2 years prior. The irony wasn't lost on him. Using the white man's tools to protect what remained of his people's way of life. His buckskin jacket bore intricate beadwork crafted by his wife's hands, a wife who, along with their 2 children, now existed only in the realm of memory. The smallpox had come 3 winters ago, brought by traders who claimed friendship. It had swept through his village with the merciless efficiency of a prairie fire, leaving behind nothing but graves and ghosts. Thomas had been away, scouting with a hunting party. By the time he returned, 43 souls had crossed into the spirit world, among them everyone who had given his life meaning. He had buried them all himself, refusing help, each shovelful of earth a penance for his absence. When the last grave was filled, Thomas had walked away from his people, unable to bear the weight of their pity, the emptiness of their well-intentioned words. He built a cabin in the remote foothills where Eagle Creek Valley met the towering pines of the Blackfoot Mountains, a place the settlers avoided due to its difficult terrain and rumors of hostile spirits. The settlers' fear suited Thomas fine. Solitude had become his only companion, silence his preferred language. He survived by trading pelts in the distant town of Providence when necessity demanded, speaking only when words could not be avoided. He took odd jobs from the settlers when game was scarce, tracking lost cattle, hunting wolves that threatened herds, guiding the occasional lost traveler back to safer paths. The white folk called him the Indian Scout, with a mixture of wariness and grudging respect. Few knew his name. Fewer still had heard him speak more than a handful of words at once. His horse, a sturdy dun mustang named Shadow, snorted as they crested a ridge overlooking the northern valley. Thomas patted the animal's neck absently, the only living creature he allowed close enough to touch. Below, the morning mist curled around stands of aspen and cottonwood, their leaves turned golden by autumn's touch. In the distance, a thin column of smoke rose from the Wilkinson Ranch, the nearest settlement to Thomas's isolated cabin. Old Jacob Wilkinson was one of the few who treated Thomas with a measure of dignity, paying fair prices for the deer and elk Thomas occasionally brought by. His wife, Margaret, always insisted on sending Thomas home with fresh bread or preserved fruit, despite his protests. Their daughter, Emma, a serious girl of 16, would watch him with curious eyes, asking questions about tracking and hunting that her father gently discouraged. "Indians have their ways, we have ours," Jacob would tell her, not unkindly. "Best not to mix them too much." Thomas never corrected them, never explained that he had attended the white man's school at the insistence of a missionary who had seen intelligence in the young boy's watchful eyes. He never mentioned the books he kept in his cabin, volumes of Shakespeare, Milton, and Thoreau that had once belonged to that same missionary before typhoid took him. What purpose would such revelations serve? In their eyes, he would always be the Indian scout, useful but never truly one of them. Distant sound caught Thomas's attention, the crack of a falling branch, perhaps, or an animal moving through the undergrowth. He reined Shadow to a halt, head cocked, listening beyond the whisper of wind through pine needles. There it was again, a disturbance in the forest's rhythm. Thomas dismounted in one fluid motion, his moccasined feet making no sound as they touched the earth. He unslung his rifle, holding it ready as he moved toward the tree line. Years as a scout, first for his people and later for settlers willing to pay, had honed his senses to a razor's edge. Something was wrong in his valley. The birds had gone silent and the forest held its breath. Thomas moved like a shadow between the trees, each step deliberate, weight distributed to avoid the betrayal of a snapped twig or rustled leaf. After 50 paces into the dense forest, he found the first sign, a partial footprint in a patch of soft soil, smaller than his own, and pressed deeply at the toe, suggesting its owner had been running. 20 yards farther, a broken branch hung at eye level, its white inner wood a beacon against the forest's darkness. Thomas touched the brake, finding it still damp with sap. Recent then, very recent. He continued tracking, his mind assembling the story written on the forest floor. A lone traveler, moving with haste but without skill, heading deeper into the mountains where the terrain grew treacherous. No woodsman would take such a path unless desperate. A lost hunter, perhaps, or a fool gold prospector who had strayed too far from known trails. Then he saw it, a scrap of pale blue fabric caught on a thorny bush, and beside it, a clear footprint in the mud of a small stream crossing. A woman's bootprint, narrow at the heel with the distinctive pattern of Eastern manufacture. Thomas knelt, fingers hovering above the impression. What was a white woman doing alone in these mountains, moving as though pursued? The answer came with the discovery of a second set of tracks approaching from the south, larger prints made by men's boots, at least 3 different pairs. They followed the woman's trail with the methodical patience of experienced hunters. Thomas's jaw tightened. He had seen such tracking patterns before, when renegades from various tribes or white bandits stalked isolated homesteads or vulnerable travelers. The woman was being hunted. Thomas straightened, his decision made before. Conscious thought formed. Whatever had brought this woman into his mountains, whatever had set these men on her trail, was not his concern. And yet, he found himself continuing forward, following her desperate flight path through the forest. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. In 3 years of self-imposed exile, little had disturbed the rhythm of his days. This intrusion of human drama into his solitude warranted investigation. He would observe, understand, and then withdraw. The affairs of settlers had long since ceased to be his concern. The trail led him to a steep ravine where the woman had apparently slid down the embankment, leaving a chaotic path of disturbed earth and dislodged stones. At the bottom, a small stream gurgled over rocks. Thomas descended carefully, noting where she had fallen, the smear of blood on a jagged stone telling of injury. Beyond the stream, her tracks became erratic, suggesting exhaustion or disorientation. The men's tracks showed they had paused at the ravine top, then separated, 2 continuing down her path, 1 circling to approach from the east. They were not just following, they were hunting, coordinating to cut off escape routes, professional manhunters perhaps, or something worse. Thomas moved faster now, guided by instinct more than conscious tracking. The woman's trail led to a dense thicket. of junipers clustering around a fallen pine. Here the signs indicated she had stopped, perhaps to rest or hide. A depression in the needles showed where she had crouched or lain. More blood, dried now, speckled the ground. The hunters had passed within yards of this hiding place, their tracks circling before continuing northward. They had missed her, at least temporarily. Thomas studied the surrounding area, puzzled. If she had remained hidden, he should find signs of her eventual departure. If she had been discovered, there would be signs of struggle or multiple tracks, leaving together. Instead, the trail simply vanished. Thomas circled the thicket, expanding his search radius. Nothing. It was as though the woman had disappeared into thin air. He returned to the fallen pine, examining it more closely. The massive trunk, partially hollowed by rot, created a natural cavity where it met the ground. Thomas crouched, peering into the shadows beneath. Two terrified eyes stared back at him. Thomas jerked backward, hand instinctively moving to his knife. The woman huddled in the hollow was barely more than a girl, perhaps 20 summers old. Her face, smeared with dirt and dried blood, was pale with exhaustion and fear. Tangled auburn hair hung around her shoulders, and her dress, once a fine blue calico, was torn and mud-stained. She clutched a small Derringer pistol in white-knuckled hands, its barrel pointed unwaveringly at his chest. For a long moment, neither moved. Thomas slowly raised his empty hands, palm outward in the universal gesture of peace. When he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse. "I mean no harm." The girl's eyes widened at his words, perhaps surprised to hear clear English from a Crow warrior. The pistol remained steady, but uncertainty flickered across her face. "They'll kill me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "If they find me, they'll kill me like they killed the others." Thomas remained still, hands visible. "Who?" "Murderers. Thieves." Her voice cracked. "They attacked our wagon train 3 days ago. Everyone else. Everyone." She couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. Thomas had seen the aftermath of such attacks before. The burned wagons, the broken bodies left for scavengers. He had helped bury the victims more than once when settlers had requested his tracking skills to find those responsible. "How many were you?" he asked quietly. 8 wagons, 22 people." Her eyes took on a distant quality. "We were heading to Oregon, a new settlement. My father had plans for a sawmill." Her grip on the pistol weakened slightly. "I was gathering berries, away from camp when I heard the shooting. I saw them from the ridge, men on horseback, firing into the wagons." Thomas nodded once. "The men are tracking you, 3 of them?" "Yes." Fear sharpened her focus again. "I saw what they did. I could identify them. That's why they're hunting me." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Decision crystallized in Thomas's mind. Against his better judgment, against the walls he had built around himself since burying his family. This girl's situation stirred something he had thought long dead, a sense of duty that transcended his isolation. "They're gone for now," he said, "tracking north, but they'll return when they realize they've lost your trail." "I can't run anymore," she admitted, the pistol finally lowering to her lap. Thomas could see now that her dress was soaked below. The knee and her boots were waterlogged. "I tried crossing the stream to hide my tracks. I fell. My ankle." Thomas moved cautiously closer, noting the swelling visible above her boot. "May I?" When she nodded, he gently examined her ankle. A sprain, not broken, but painful enough to make further flight impossible. The girl winced, but did not cry out. Thomas was struck by her resilience. Days alone in wilderness, hunted by killers, injured and exhausted, yet still fighting to survive. "What's your name?" he asked, sitting back on his heels. She hesitated, weighing whether to trust him with even this small piece of herself. Rebecca Ainsworth." Thomas Blackfeather, he replied, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so long without speaking it. My cabin is 4 miles east. You'll be safer there until your ankle heals. And then? Her question hung. Between them, Thomas had no answer. The nearest town, Providence, was 2 days' ride. The territorial authorities were there, but would they believe a white girl accompanied by an Indian? Would they act against the men hunting her, or would they see an opportunity to blame another attack on hostile natives? First, safety, he said finally. Then we decide. Rebecca's grip tightened on her pistol again. How do I know I can trust you? The question struck him as both reasonable and ironic. In her place, he would ask the same. You don't, he answered honestly. But those men will return by nightfall. Your choice is simple, trust me or wait for them. Her scrutiny was intense, measuring him against some internal standard. Whatever she saw in his weathered face must have satisfied her, for she finally nodded and began awkwardly maneuvering out of her hiding place. Thomas whistled softly, 2 notes that carried through the trees. Within minutes, Shadow appeared, picking his way carefully down the slope. The horse snorted at the sight of the stranger, but stood calmly as Thomas helped Rebecca to her feet. You won't make it 4 miles on that ankle, he said, guiding her to Shadow's side. The horse will carry you. Rebecca eyed the Mustang warily. I've never ridden without a saddle. Shadow is steady. Hold his mane if you need balance. Thomas made a stirrup with his hands, boosting her onto the horse's back with gentle efficiency. As they began the journey toward his cabin, Thomas remained alert, rifle ready, senses attuned to any sign of the returning hunters. Behind him, Rebecca swayed slightly on Shadow's back, exhaustion beginning to overcome fear now that she was no longer alone. Why are you helping me? She asked suddenly, breaking the silence of their journey. Thomas continued walking, eyes scanning the trail ahead. The question pierced deeper than she could know, touching the core of what he had become since burying. His family. Why, indeed. He had turned his back on both worlds, the white settlers' community and what remained of his own people. He had chosen solitude, embracing the numbing comfort of a life without attachments. There is an old saying among my people, he said finally. The path you walk is shown to you by those you meet along the way. It wasn't really an answer, but it was all he had to offer. Perhaps, in helping this girl, he might find something he had lost, or perhaps he was merely postponing her inevitable confrontation with the men who had destroyed her world. Either way, Thomas Blackfeather had stepped back into the affairs of humans, and he sensed that nothing would be the same. Again, Thomas Blackfeather's cabin stood as a testament to solitude, nestled against the eastern slope of a hill where forest met meadow. Built with his own hands after abandoning his people, the structure was sturdy but sparse. A single room, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow bed against the far wall. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a rack of cured meats occupied one corner. Books, his secret indulgence, were carefully stacked on a shelf he'd crafted from pine. Rebecca Ainsworth's eyes widened as Thomas carried her across the threshold. The cabin's interior was immaculate, each object arranged with purpose, contradicting expectations of how an isolated Indian scout might live. You have books, she said, voice tinged with surprise, as Thomas set her gently on a wooden chair. Thomas moved to the fireplace, stirring embers to life without acknowledging her observation. Your ankle needs tending. He worked in silence, gathering supplies, strips of clean cloth, a jar of pungent salve, and a kettle of water he set to heat over the rekindled fire. Rebecca watched him move with economic grace. A man accustomed to solving problems alone. Where did you learn medicine? She asked when he knelt before her, carefully removing her ruined boot. My grandmother was a healer. His voice was low, each word deliberate. And the missionary who taught me reading also taught basic doctoring. Rebecca winced as he examined her swollen ankle, his touch unexpectedly gentle for hands so weathered. You read English well, then? He glanced up, a flicker of something, perhaps amusement in his dark eyes. Shakespeare, Melville, Emerson. He indicated the shelf of books. The missionary believed education would civilize me. The bitterness in that last word hung between them as he applied the salve to her ankle, its sharp herbal scent filling the cabin. Rebecca bit her lip against the sting, determined not to cry out. She had done enough crying in the 3 days since the massacre, hiding in hollow logs and shallow caves, choking back sobs that might betray her location to the hunters. "It will heal," Thomas said, wrapping her ankle with practiced efficiency. "But not quickly. You cannot travel for at least a week." A week. The reality of her situation crashed over Rebecca anew. A week in this remote cabin with a man who was a stranger, while killers searched the wilderness for her. A week before she could even begin the journey to civilization, to authorities who might, or might not, believe her account of the wagon train massacre. "Those men," she began, "will not find this place easily," Thomas finished, rising to hang the kettle away from direct flame. "Few know of its existence. Those who do avoid it. Because you live here." The question slipped out before she could reconsider its potential offense. Thomas's expression remained impassive. "Because they believe the spirits of my ancestors haunt these hills." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I do nothing to correct them." He moved to a trunk in the corner, retrieving a worn but clean shirt and trousers. "Your dress is ruined. These will serve until it can be washed and mended." Rebecca accepted the clothing with murmured thanks, suddenly conscious of her bedraggled appearance. 3 days in the wilderness had left her filthy, her once fine calico dress torn and stained with mud, sap, and blood, some her own, from scratches and falls, some splattered from... She closed her eyes against the memory of the attack. Sensing her distress, Thomas turned away. "I will check the perimeter, change if you wish. There is water in the basin." He indicated a wooden bowl on a small table. "I will knock before returning." When the door closed behind him, Rebecca sat motionless, overwhelmed by the strange turn her life had taken. Just 4 days ago, she had been traveling with her father and the 7 other families, full of hope for their new life in Oregon. Samuel Ainsworth had sold everything in Pennsylvania to finance this venture. A sawmill in the new settlement where timber was plentiful and opportunity awaited. "We're building something that will last, Becky," he had told her the night before the attack, his eyes alight with dreams as they sat around the campfire. "Something with our name on it. The Ainsworth Mill has a fine sound, doesn't it?" Now he was gone. All of them are gone. And she was alone in a Crow warrior's cabin, dependent on the mercy of a man who had every reason to despise settlers like her family. With effort, Rebecca began the painful process of changing. Thomas's shirt hung to her knees, the trousers requiring a piece of rope to cinch around her waist. Both smelled of pine smoke and herbs, not unpleasant. She used the basin water to wash her face and hands, wincing at the scratches and bruises revealed beneath the grime. Her reflection in the small mirror hanging by the door showed a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale beneath her sunburn, auburn hair, a tangled mess. She attempted to comb it with her fingers, then gave up, plaiting it into a simple braid instead. A soft knock announced Thomas's return. He entered carrying an armful of firewood, his expression revealing nothing about what he might have found outside. Rebecca watched as he stacked the logs precisely by the hearth, each movement methodical. "No sign of pursuit," he said finally, answering her unasked question. "But they will expand their search when the northern trail proves false." "How long do we have?" Thomas considered. "A day, perhaps 2. Rebecca's hand moved unconsciously to the pocket of her discarded dress, where a folded document rested, the deed to her father's Oregon claim, the only thing she had managed to salvage before fleeing the massacre. That paper, and the small Derringer pistol her father had insisted she carry, were all that remained of her former life. "I should tell you why they're hunting me," she said. "What happened on the wagon train?" Thomas sat on a three-legged stool, his posture attentive but not demanding. Rebecca drew a deep breath, organizing the chaotic memories that had haunted her sleepless nights in the forest. "We left Springfield 2 months ago. 8 wagons, 22 people. My father, Samuel Ainsworth, organized the group. All families. Heading to the Oregon Territory to join a new settlement." Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, the act of narration creating distance from the horror. "We had a guide, Micah Sullivan, who came highly recommended. He knew the trails, the water sources, how to deal with any tribes we encountered." Thomas's expression remained neutral at this, though Rebecca sensed a subtle tension in his shoulders. 3 days ago, I was gathering berries away from the camp. We had stopped early because one of the wagons had a broken axle. She twisted her hands in her lap. "I heard shooting. When I climbed the ridge to see, they were already dead or dying. Men on horseback firing into the wagons, dragging people out." Her voice faltered. Thomas waited, neither pushing nor retreating from her pain. "I recognized them," she continued, forcing the words out. "Sullivan, our guide, and 2 others who had joined our party a week earlier, brothers named Ethan and Levi Chambers. They claimed to be heading to Oregon as well, but they kept to themselves. My father thought they were just private men." "They waited until you were far from settlements," Thomas observed. "Gained your trust," Rebecca nodded. "Sullivan knew which families carried valuables. The Millers had their life savings in gold. The Winstons had jewelry from Mrs. Winston's mother. My father had cash for the sawmill equipment. And after they took these things," Rebecca's eyes took on a haunted quality, "they killed everyone, even the children, set fire to 2 of the wagons." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I heard Mrs. Winston screaming as the flames—" She couldn't continue. Thomas rose and moved to the fireplace, giving her space to compose. Herself. He added a log to the fire, watching the bark catch and curl before speaking again. "You were seen." It wasn't a question, but Rebecca answered anyway. "Sullivan looked up, straight at me on the ridge. I ran. They've been hunting me ever since. You could identify them, connect them to the massacre." Thomas turned to face her. "Did you take anything from the camp? Something they want besides your silence?" Rebecca hesitated, then reached for her dress, extracting the folded document from its pocket. "Just this, my father's land deed. It's all I have left of him." She didn't mention the small leather pouch of coins, also hidden in the dress's seam, sewn there by her father for emergencies. "Nothing else? Nothing you might have witnessed that would drive them to hunt a girl through dangerous territory for 3 days? Rebecca's brow furrowed. "I don't think so. I was too far to see details, just the killing." A thought struck her. "Though when I was running, I heard Sullivan shout to the others, something about making sure she doesn't have the map." Thomas's interest sharpened visibly. "Map? I don't know what he meant. My father had maps of Oregon, but nothing special." She shook her head. Unless, Thomas prompted when she fell silent. 2 nights before the attack, I woke to voices. My father and Mr. Winston talking. By the fire, looking at something. They stopped when they noticed me." Rebecca frowned, the memory clarifying. "The next morning I asked father about it. He said it was nothing, just a potential shortcut Sullivan had mentioned." Thomas considered this information, absently running a finger along the scar that cut through his right eyebrow. A valuable secret, perhaps, something worth killing for. "But I don't have any map," Rebecca insisted. "If there was one, it must have burned with the wagons or been taken by Sullivan." They believe otherwise, Thomas said simply, or they would not still be searching. The implication hung in the air between them. As long as Sullivan and the Chambers brothers believed Rebecca might possess something valuable, they would not abandon their hunt. And if they ever caught her, the truth of her ignorance wouldn't save her. The realization must have shown on her face, for Thomas's expression softened marginally. "Rest," he said, moving to the door. "I need to prepare defenses, in case they come sooner than expected." "You've already risked enough," Rebecca said. "These men, they're killers, cold-blooded. They murdered children without hesitation." Thomas paused, his hand on the door latch. "I am familiar with such men." Something in his tone made Rebecca shiver. "What will you do if they find us?" Thomas Blackfeather's eyes held hers, and in them she saw something ancient and unwavering. Not bloodlust or bravado, but the calm certainty of a man who had faced death many times. "What is necessary," he answered, and stepped outside. Left alone, Rebecca fought the exhaustion threatening to overcome her. 3 days of terror and flight, sleeping in fitful bursts with one eye open, had drained her reserves. But questions tumbled through her mind, preventing surrender to sleep. Why had Thomas helped her? What drove a man to such isolation? And how could she reconcile the gentle healer who had tended her ankle with the warrior whose very name, Blackfeather, suggested? A reputation she could only guess at. Her gaze drifted to the shelf of books, an incongruous presence in this frontier cabin. She hobbled over, curious about what a Crow Scout might read in his solitude. The volumes surprised her. Shakespeare's collected works, Thoreau's Walden, several volumes of poetry by Whitman and Longfellow, medical texts, and a worn Bible. A small wooden frame caught her attention, partially hidden behind the books. Rebecca hesitated, then carefully moved the volume, concealing it. The frame contained a drawing, skillfully rendered in charcoal, a woman with high cheekbones and serene eyes, holding a laughing infant, while a young boy of perhaps 5 stood proudly beside them. The artist had captured joy in each face, a moment of perfect contentment preserved on paper. "My wife, our children," Rebecca startled, nearly dropping the frame. Thomas stood in the doorway, his silent approach undetected. She fumbled to replace the drawing, embarrassment heating her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have pried." Thomas crossed the room and took the frame from her trembling hands, studying the faces with an expression of such raw grief that Rebecca had to look away. "Smallpox," he said, the single word laden with unspeakable loss. 3 winters ago." "I'm so sorry," Rebecca whispered, understanding now the source of his isolation, the emptiness she had glimpsed behind his stoic facade. Thomas returned the drawing to its place, his fingers lingering on the frame before he turned away. "We have more immediate concerns. Night approaches, and with it, danger." He moved to a chest near the bed, opening it to reveal an assortment of weapons, another rifle, a cavalry pistol, several knives, and a tomahawk with intricate carvings on its handle. He removed these methodically, arranging them on the table with the precision of a man preparing for battle. "You know how to use that derringer," he said, nodding toward the small pistol Rebecca had placed beside her makeshift bed. "My father taught me," she confirmed, "though it only has 2 shots. Thomas handed her the cavalry pistol. "This has 6. Heavier, but more reliable at distance." He demonstrated how to load and cock it, his instructions clear and patient. As darkness fell, Thomas secured the cabin's single window with wooden shutters designed for defense. He checked and rechecked the door's sturdy bar, tested sight lines through narrow gaps in the walls, and positioned weapons at strategic points throughout the small space. "Sleep if you can," he told Rebecca, who sat wrapped in a blanket by the fire. "I will keep watch, but sleep seemed impossible. Outside, the wind had risen, carrying with it the distant howl of wolves. Inside, Thomas moved with predatory alertness, a warrior preparing for an enemy he knew would eventually come. "Why did you help me?" Rebecca asked suddenly, breaking the tense silence. "You could have left me in the forest. It would have been safer for you." Thomas paused in his preparations, considering her question with the same gravity he seemed to give every matter. When he finally answered, his words were measured, as if drawn from a deep well of thought. "There is a balance to all things," he said, "life and death, joy and sorrow, action and inaction." He checked the edge of a knife with his thumb. 3 winters ago, I returned to find my family dead. No one could help them. No one could help me carry that grief." His eyes met hers, dark and fathomless. "Perhaps in helping you, I restore something to the balance." It wasn't the answer Rebecca had expected, but she sensed its truth and its incompleteness. There was more to Thomas Blackfeather than this philosophical resignation, more driving him than abstract notions of cosmic equilibrium. Before she could probe further, a sound from outside froze them both, the distant but unmistakable whinny of a horse, quickly silenced. Thomas extinguished the lamp with a swift motion, leaving only the fire's dim glow. He moved to the window, peering through a narrow crack in the shutters. "They've found us," he whispered, his voice betraying neither fear nor surprise, only a grim acceptance. 3 riders approaching from the south. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. Sullivan and the Chambers brothers. Thomas nodded, moving away from the window to gather his weapons. "They will wait for dawn, better visibility." "What do we do?" Rebecca struggled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her ankle. Thomas handed her the cavalry pistol and a knife with a bone handle. "We prepare, and when the time comes..." His eyes held hers, their intensity burning away any pretense. "We fight." In that moment, as moonlight filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls and danger circled outside, Rebecca Ainsworth understood that her life had irreversibly changed course. The daughter of a Pennsylvania businessman, raised on aspirations of respectable frontier entrepreneurship, now stood alongside a Crow warrior preparing for battle against the men who had destroyed her world. And strangely, improbably, she felt more clarity than she had in the 3 days of desperate flight. Thomas Blackfeather, this enigmatic man who had saved her, was now her ally in survival. Whatever came with the dawn, they would face it together, the sole survivor of a Wagon massacre and the wounded protector who had found her tracks. Dawn arrived with a stillness that seemed to hold its breath. The usual chorus of birdsong was absent, silenced by the presence of intruders. Thomas crouched by the window, his Winchester ready, counting the minutes as the sky shifted from charcoal to pale lavender. Rebecca sat against the far wall, the cavalry pistol heavy in her lap. She had not slept. How could she, knowing Sullivan and the Chambers brothers were out there, planning their approach? Her ankle throbbed dully, but fear had pushed the pain to the periphery of her awareness. "They've split up," Thomas whispered, his keen eyes tracking movement through the narrow gap in the shutters. One circling north to the ridge behind the cabin, 2 approaching from the front. "Sullivan will take the high ground," Rebecca said with certainty. "He was a sharpshooter in the war. He told stories about it on the trail." Thomas nodded, absorbing this information without comment. "Can you reach that corner?" He gestured to a position with a view of the cabin's rear wall. Rebecca tested her weight on her injured ankle, wincing but managing to limp to the indicated spot. Through a small gap in the logs, she could see the wooded slope rising behind the cabin. "Watch. For movement," Thomas instructed. "Don't fire unless you have no choice. We conserve ammunition." The silence stretched, marked only by their controlled breathing and the occasional creak of the cabin's timbers. Thomas moved like a shadow between vantage points, his presence somehow reassuring despite the dire circumstances. "Why not just burn us out?" Rebecca whispered, voicing the question that had troubled her through the night. "They burned the wagons." "Too visible," Thomas replied without looking away from his window. "Smoke would draw attention from miles away. There's a cavalry patrol that passes through these hills twice monthly." This made sense, yet Rebecca sensed another reason, one Thomas wasn't sharing. But before she could press further, movement caught her eye. A figure darting between trees on the ridge, sunlight glinting off something metallic. "Ridge," she hissed, "moving east." Thomas was beside her instantly, peering through the gap. "Sullivan," he confirmed. "Rifle with brass fittings. Distinctive. His." Calm identification of their pursuers was unsettling. It was one thing to know danger approached in the abstract, quite another to have it named and quantified. "What's our plan?" Rebecca asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Thomas met her gaze, his dark eyes unreadable. "They believe we are unaware. They will attempt to position themselves for clean shots when we emerge. We let them think they have the advantage. And then, the ghost of a smile touched his lips, we show them their mistake." He moved to the fireplace and carefully extracted several small pouches from a hidden cavity in the stonework. Rebecca watched. As he methodically arranged their contents on the table, lumps of a waxy substance, strips of cloth, small river stones, and what appeared to be gunpowder. "What are those for?" "Distraction," Thomas answered, deftly assembling small packages with the materials. "When a wolf hunts, it watches its prey's eyes, not its surroundings." Rebecca frowned, not following his meaning, but Thomas offered no further explanation. Instead, he retrieved a coiled rope from a hook by the door. "Can you shoot?" he asked, checking the cavalry pistol in her hands. Rebecca nodded. Her father had insisted she learn, despite her mother's objections before her. Death 5 years earlier. Samuel Ainsworth believed frontier life required practical skills, regardless of gender. "I won't freeze," she promised, though her stomach churned at the thought of taking a life, even one belonging to the men who had murdered her father and the others. "Good." Thomas secured the rope around his waist. "I will draw them away from the cabin. When you hear 3 owl calls, open the door, but remain inside." Alarm flared in Rebecca's chest. "You're going out there? Alone? Against 3 armed men?" "Yes." The simplicity of his response left her momentarily speechless. When she found her voice again, it emerged as a harsh whisper. "That's suicide. They'll kill you and then come for me." Thomas continued his preparations, seemingly unmoved by her concern. "They are hunters of wagon trains, not warriors. They expect fear and compliance, not resistance." He checked his knife's edge with his thumb. "And they know nothing of these woods. I have the advantage." "At least wait until dark," Rebecca pleaded. "We could slip away together." Thomas shook his head. "Your ankle cannot manage difficult terrain, and they will be most alert at nightfall." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "This is necessary, Rebecca Ainsworth." The use of her full name, spoken with such quiet conviction, stilled her objections. Thomas Blackfeather had made his decision, weighing risks and options she could only guess at. Who was she to question the judgment of a man who had survived in this wilderness for years while she had barely managed 3 days? "What do I do if—" She couldn't complete the sentence. "If I don't return." Thomas secured his knife in its sheath. "Bar the door. Use the pistol only when they are close. Each shot must count." He moved toward her. Something clutched in his palm. Opening her hand, he placed a small carved wooden bird in it, a sparrow, its details exquisitely rendered despite its diminutive size. "My son made this," Thomas said, his voice low. "He believed sparrows guided lost souls home. Keep it close." Before Rebecca could respond, a faint sound reached them, the snap of a twig outside. too deliberate to be wildlife. Thomas immediately motioned for silence, pointing toward the door's bar. Rebecca nodded her understanding. When he left, she was to secure the cabin. With surprising agility for such a large man, Thomas slipped through the small window at the rear of the cabin, barely disturbing the shutter. Rebecca immediately secured it behind him, then returned. To her vantage point, the wooden sparrow clutched in her palm like a talisman. Outside, Thomas Blackfeather became one with the forest. He moved through underbrush with a stillness that belied his size, leaving no trail, making no sound. The pouches he had prepared were secured at his belt, the rope coiled at his side. His Winchester remained in the cabin with Rebecca, a calculated decision. The rifle was too unwieldy for what he planned, and its report would echo for miles, potentially bringing unwanted attention from any settlers or patrols in the area. Instead, he carried his hunting knife and a tomahawk that had belonged to his father, its head inscribed with symbols of protection. Thomas did not consider himself a superstitious man, but these symbols connected him to his ancestors. Today, he would need their strength. Circling wide to avoid detection, he tracked Sullivan's movement on the ridge. The man was attempting to find a position with a clear view of the cabin's entrance, unaware that his quarry had already slipped away. Thomas noted the former guide's technique, professional but overconfident, leaving signs of his passage that might as well have been a shout in the stillness. Advancing silently, Thomas located the first of the Chambers brothers, Ethan, the younger one with a red beard, positioned behind a fallen tree 50 yards from the cabin's front door. He clutched a shotgun, eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting for inhabitants who would never emerge as expected. The second brother, Levi, proved more challenging to find. Thomas scouted the perimeter carefully before locating him in a cluster of young aspens to the west. The older Chambers was methodically checking a lever-action rifle, a bandolier of ammunition across his chest. This one moved with greater caution, repeatedly scanning his surroundings. Thomas retreated, considering his strategy. 3 experienced killers, all armed, positioned to triangulate fire on the cabin. A direct confrontation would be disastrous. Instead, he would need to separate them, neutralize them one by one. He began with the first of his prepared packages. Moving to a position downwind from Ethan Chambers' location, Thomas struck a match and touched it to the wick he had embedded in the waxy substance. The package began to smoke profusely, releasing a bitter, acrid scent that would carry on the breeze. Thomas retreated quickly, circling back toward Sullivan's position on the ridge. As expected, Ethan Chambers reacted to the smoke, rising partially from his hiding place to locate its source. The distraction would be temporary, but sufficient for Thomas's purpose. Reaching the ridge's edge, Thomas placed his second package in a crevice between rocks. This one designed not to smoke, but to create a sharp, explosive sound when the wick burned down. He lit it, then moved swiftly around the ridge's shoulder, positioning himself above Sullivan's location. The shooter had indeed found an excellent vantage point, a natural depression behind a lightning-struck pine that offered clear sightlines to the cabin while providing cover. Sullivan lay prone, a Springfield rifle with brass fittings braced before him, seemingly unaware of the shifting dynamics around him. Thomas waited, counting heartbeats. When the explosive crack of his second package shattered the morning silence, Sullivan reacted instinctively, jerking toward the sound. In that moment of distraction, Thomas struck. He dropped from above, landing squarely on Sullivan's back. The guide's surprised grunt turned into a choked gasp as Thomas's forearm locked around his throat. Sullivan bucked and thrashed, but Thomas held firm, applying pressure to the carotid arteries rather than the windpipe, a technique that rendered an opponent unconscious within seconds. Sullivan's struggles weakened, then ceased. Thomas bound him quickly with strips of rawhide from his pouch, gagging him with a bandana. The guide would remain unconscious for several minutes, time enough for Thomas to deal with the remaining threats. From the ridge, Thomas had a clear view of the Chambers brothers' positions. As expected, both had reacted to the explosive sound, rising from cover to identify its source. Ethan had actually started moving toward the ridge, shotgun at the ready, leaving his assigned position. Levi remained more cautious, gesturing frantically for his brother to take cover. Thomas retrieved Sullivan's Springfield rifle, checking its load. 6 rounds, more than enough. He would not use it if possible. The report would carry for miles, but having it improved his options. The third package was the most complex, containing small amounts of gunpowder mixed with pine resin. Thomas positioned it carefully between the brothers' locations, directly in Ethan's path as the younger Chambers approached the ridge. This one would create both noise and a brief, intense flash. Thomas circled back down the ridge, using the terrain to remain unseen. As he neared the position where he had last spotted Levi Chambers, he heard urgent whispers. "Ethan, get back here, damn it, it's a trick!" The older brother had realized something was wrong. Thomas accelerated his plan, striking a match to ignite his final package before retreating to a position behind Levi Chambers' location. The resulting flash and bang was more impressive than even Thomas had anticipated. Ethan Chambers yelped in alarm, stumbling backward, while Levi rose fully from his hiding place, rifle raised. "Ethan, down!" Levi shouted, abandoning stealth as he rushed toward his brother. It was the opening Thomas needed. He moved like a shadow, closing the distance to Levi in 3 long strides. The older Chambers sensed movement too late, beginning to turn as Thomas struck. The tomahawk connected with Levi's rifle, knocking it from his grasp. Before Levi could recover, Thomas delivered a swift blow to the temple with the weapon's flat side, dropping the man to his knees. Ethan, hearing the struggle, charged forward with a roar, shotgun raised. Thomas ducked behind Levi's collapsing form as the younger brother fired, the scattered shot mostly missing its target. 1 pellet grazed Thomas's arm, leaving a burning trail across his bicep. Before Ethan could reload, Thomas launched himself forward, tackling the younger Chambers. They crashed to the ground, the shotgun trapped between them. Ethan was strong, his face contorted with rage and fear as he fought to free his weapon. "Indian devil!" he spat, driving a knee into Thomas's side. Thomas grunted at the impact, but maintained his grip. In close quarters, his experience proved decisive. He headbutted Ethan, the sharp crack of impact stunning the younger man long enough for Thomas to wrench the shotgun away. A final blow with the weapon's stock rendered Ethan Chambers unconscious. Breathing heavily, Thomas secured both brothers with strips of rawhide from his pouch. The entire confrontation had taken less than 5 minutes from the first distraction to the final blow. Blood trickled from the pellet wound on his arm, but the injury was minor, more annoyance than threat. Thomas let out 3 distinct owl calls, the signal for Rebecca. Then he began the process of dragging his captives toward the cabin. Sullivan was still unconscious when Thomas returned for him, easily managed despite his size. The Crow warrior arranged all 3 men in a row before the cabin door, their weapons stacked well out of reach. When Rebecca finally opened the door, her eyes widened at the sight of their captors, now captives. Sullivan was beginning to stir, moaning behind his gag. The Chambers brothers remained motionless, though their chests rose and fell with steady breaths. "You..." Rebecca stared at Thomas, searching for words. "How did you..." "They expected a different hunt," Thomas said simply, retrieving rope from inside the cabin to better secure the men. "Help me bind them more thoroughly. They will be fully conscious soon." Working together, they secured the 3 men to sturdy pine trunks that Thomas dragged into position. Rebecca's movements were mechanical, her face pale as she faced the men who had destroyed her world. When Sullivan's eyes finally opened, fixing on her with undisguised hatred, she flinched but didn't look away. "What now?" she asked Thomas when the task was complete. "We can't keep them here." Thomas examined the gash on his arm, cleaning it with water from a canteen. "Now," he said, "we learn what they know." "About the map?" Rebecca frowned. "I told you I don't have any map." "Yet they hunted you for 3 days," Thomas pointed out. "Men do not expend such effort without purpose." He approached Sullivan, whose glare held equal parts rage and calculation. Thomas removed the gag, stepping back to avoid any attempt to spit or bite. "Micah Sullivan," Thomas said, his voice level. "Guide and murderer." Sullivan's jaw worked, his initial fury giving way to a mask of indifference. "Who the hell are you?" "The man who decided whether you live or die," Thomas answered calmly. "Your companions will wake soon. What happens next depends on your cooperation." Sullivan barked a laugh, though fear flickered behind his eyes. "You think I'm afraid of you, Indian? The army'll hang you for touching white men, no matter what you think we've done." "The army," Thomas said, "is not here. And when they do come, they will find 3 men who massacred a wagon train of settlers, including women and children. The survivors' testimony will be compelling." "Her word against ours," Sullivan countered, though with less conviction. 3 of us, 1 girl. Who do you think they'll believe?" Rebecca stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "You murdered my father," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Everyone at that camp. For what? Money? Gold?" Sullivan's eyes narrowed, calculating. His gaze flicked from Rebecca to Thomas and back. "Give us the map, girl, and maybe we can come to an arrangement. You walk away, we walk away. No one has to die here." "What map?" Rebecca demanded. "I don't have any map." Sullivan studied her face, seeming to search for deception. "Winston showed it to your father the night before. We saw them by the fire. Your father took it." "I don't know what you're talking about." Rebecca's frustration was genuine. "My father never gave me any map." A groan from Ethan Chambers interrupted the exchange. The younger brother was regaining consciousness, his eyes unfocused as he struggled against his bonds. Levy remained still, the blow to his temple having rendered him deeply unconscious. Thomas returned the gag to Sullivan's mouth, ignoring the man's muffled protests. He turned to Rebecca, his expression thoughtful. "Your father had time to prepare." "You?" he said. "When did you last speak with him before the attack?" Rebecca shook her head, pain crossing her features at the memory. "At breakfast, he was distracted, worried about something. He gave me chores, told me to gather berries for the noon meal." Her brow furrowed. "He hugged me before I left. It seemed strange at the time, unusually emotional." "Did he give you anything? Any object, however seemingly insignificant?" Rebecca was about to deny it when realization dawned. "My locket!" she whispered, reaching for the silver oval hanging from a chain around her neck. "He insisted I wear it that morning, said it belonged to my mother and should be with me always." With trembling fingers, she removed the locket, its silver surface etched with delicate flowers. It had been a fixture around her neck for so long that she had ceased to notice its presence. Opening it revealed a miniature daguerreotype of her mother on one side, but the other side, which should have held her father's image, was empty. "It's hollow," Rebecca murmured, pressing the edges experimentally. To her surprise, the seemingly solid backing of the empty side gave way, revealing a hidden compartment. From it, she extracted a tightly folded square of thin paper. Sullivan's eyes widened behind his gag, his renewed struggles confirming they had found what the killers sought. With unsteady hands, Rebecca unfolded the paper, revealing a meticulously drawn map. Unlike standard trail maps, this one focused on a specific mountain range, with a winding path marked in red ink leading to a canyon labeled simply Blackwater Claim. "A gold mine," Thomas said softly, examining the map over Rebecca's shoulder. An unknown claim. The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her father and Winston had discovered the location of an unregistered gold deposit, information valuable enough to kill for. Samuel Ainsworth had suspected danger, hiding the map in his daughter's locket before sending her away from Camp On, a task that ultimately saved her life. "He knew," she whispered, tears finally breaking through her control. "He knew something was wrong. That's why he made sure I had this, and why he sent me away from camp." Thomas's hand settled briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that seemed to surprise them both with its naturalness. When he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness she hadn't heard before. "Your father saved your life, Rebecca Ainsworth. Now we must decide what to do with this knowledge." Rebecca stared at the map, then at the men who had murdered 21 people for its promise of riches. Sullivan's eyes burned with undimmed greed. Ethan Chambers was now fully conscious, confusion giving way to fear as he assessed their situation. Levi began to stir, groaning behind his gag. "The army patrol you mentioned," Rebecca said slowly. "How soon will they pass through?" 3 days, perhaps 4, Thomas replied. "But we cannot hold these men securely for so long. Not here." "Then we take them to the authorities ourselves," Rebecca decided, a newfound resolve hardening her voice. "Providence is 2 days' ride, you said. My ankle is improving. I can manage with help." Thomas studied her with something like respect. It would not be an easy journey. These men are dangerous, even bound. "So are we," Rebecca said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. She looked at the captive killers, then back to Thomas. "At least you are, and I'm learning." A fleeting smile crossed Thomas's face, transforming it briefly into something younger, less burdened. "Yes," he agreed, "you are learning." As they began preparations for the journey, securing provisions, fashioning a travois for the prisoners, planning their route, Rebecca became aware of a subtle shift between them. The wary distance that had characterized their initial interactions had softened, replaced by something not yet trust, but moving in that direction. Thomas Blackfeather, the solitary warrior who had found her tracks in the forest, and Rebecca Ainsworth, the sole survivor of a wagon massacre, were forming a connection neither had anticipated, a bridge across worlds built on shared danger and emerging respect. That night, as they took turns standing watch over their captives, Rebecca caught Thomas, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. When she met his gaze questioningly, he simply said, "You have your father's courage." Coming from Thomas Blackfeather, she understood this was the highest praise he could offer. And somehow, amidst the tragedy and danger surrounding them, it kindled a small flame of hope that she might yet survive, not just in body, but in spirit, carrying forward the legacy of Samuel Ainsworth in ways neither of them could have imagined. When they set out for Oregon just months before, the wooden sparrow Thomas had given her remained in her pocket, a tangible reminder that lost souls sometimes found unexpected guides on their journey home. The morning broke with a rare clarity, the sky washed clean by a brief pre-dawn shower. Thomas worked methodically, securing the prisoners to the travois he had constructed, a sturdy frame of pine lashed together with rawhide, designed to be pulled behind his Mustang, Shadow. The 3 men lay bound side by side, their expressions varying from Sullivan's calculating glare to Ethan Chambers's undisguised terror. Rebecca watched from the cabin doorway, her father's map carefully refolded, and returned to the locket around her neck. She had slept fitfully, troubled by nightmares of the massacre interspersed with new fears about the journey ahead. Providence lay 2 days' ride to the east, across terrain that would challenge even experienced travelers, let alone an injured woman and a lone warrior escorting 3 dangerous prisoners. "Your ankle?" Thomas inquired, testing the travois bindings one final time. Rebecca took a few experimental steps. The swelling had subsided somewhat, and Thomas's herbal poultice had reduced the worst of the pain. "Better," she answered. "I can ride." Thomas nodded, seemingly satisfied. He had fashioned a makeshift saddle from blankets and leather straps, knowing Rebecca was unaccustomed to riding bareback for extended periods. Shadow would carry her, while Thomas would lead the horse and travois on foot. "What about the cabin?" Rebecca asked as Thomas secured the last of their provisions: dried meat, hardtack, a canteen of water, and medicinal herbs. "It will remain," he said simply, "as it has before." There was something final in his tone that Rebecca didn't understand. She had assumed they would return after delivering the prisoners, that Thomas would resume his solitary existence, and she would— What? The question of her future hung unanswered. With her father gone and their Oregon plans destroyed, she had no clear path forward. As Thomas helped her mount Shadow, adjusting the stirrups he had improvised from rope, a flicker of movement caught Rebecca's eye, a distant glint of sunlight on metal quickly gone. "Thomas," she said, keeping her voice low, "on the ridge, I saw something." Thomas didn't look up immediately, maintaining the appearance of adjusting Shadow's bridle. "How many?" he asked quietly. "I'm not sure. Just a flash of light. Like sun on a gun barrel." With practiced nonchalance, Thomas finished his task, then stretched casually, using the motion to scan the ridge. His expression revealed nothing, but Rebecca sensed his sudden tension. "We've delayed too long," he said, gathering Shadow's reins. "We leave now." "Who is it?" Rebecca pressed, anxiety tightening her chest. "Not cavalry," Thomas replied. "Their approach would be direct, not concealed." He glanced at Sullivan, whose smug expression confirmed Rebecca's worst fears. "You were expecting someone," she accused the guide. "Reinforcements." Sullivan's smile widened behind his gag, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. Thomas yanked the cloth down, allowing the man to speak. "You think it was just us three?" Sullivan laughed. "Blackwater's the biggest strike since California. Oh, girl, we've got partners, powerful men who want that map just as badly as we do." "Who?" Thomas demanded. Sullivan's gaze shifted to the ridge, then back to Thomas. "Judge Fletcher, ring a bell, Indian? Controls half the mining claims in the territory. Man like that doesn't take kindly to being cut out of a discovery like Blackwater." Rebecca's blood ran cold. Judge Harrison Fletcher was a name even she recognized, a territorial magistrate whose influence extended throughout Montana and into neighboring territories. He had been mentioned with reverence around the wagon trains, campfires, a symbol of civilization's advance into the frontier. "You're lying," she said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. "Am I?" Sullivan's confident tone suggested otherwise. "Who do you think supplied us with information about which wagon trains carried valuable cargo? Who ensured no questions were asked when travelers disappeared?" Thomas replaced the gag with swift efficiency, his expression unreadable. "We need to move," he told Rebecca. "Different route than planned." "If Fletcher's men are coming," Rebecca began. "They're already here," Thomas cut her off, his voice low and urgent. "At least 4, based on the tracks I found yesterday. They've been watching, waiting for Sullivan to return with the map." The realization struck Rebecca with physical force. These weren't just random killers. They were part of an organized operation, protected by one of the territory's most powerful men. No wonder Sullivan had been so confident about avoiding consequences for the massacre. "We can't outrun them with the prisoners," she said, logic cutting through her fear. Thomas's jaw tightened as he reached the same conclusion. "No," he agreed, "but we can't release them either." Then what? A shot cracked through the morning air, sending splinters flying from the cabin wall inches from Thomas's head. Shadow reared in alarm, nearly unseating Rebecca as Thomas pulled. the horse down behind the shelter of the travois. "Stay down," he ordered, drawing his knife and severing the rawhide bindings connecting the travois to Shadow's harness. "When I give the signal, ride east along the creek. Don't stop until you reach the split rock formation." "I'm not leaving you," Rebecca protested, clinging to Shadow's mane as the horse danced nervously. Thomas met her gaze, his dark eyes intense. "Trust me, Rebecca Ainsworth, I will find you." Before she could argue further, Thomas slapped Shadow's flank, sending the horse bolting away from the cabin, with Rebecca desperately holding on. More shots followed, but the shooter's angle from the ridge prevented clear targets as horse and rider vanished into the tree line. Thomas turned his attention to the prisoners. Sullivan was already thrashing against his bonds, sensing opportunity in the chaos. With swift efficiency, Thomas dragged the travois into the cabin, ignoring the curses that escaped around Sullivan's gag. "Your reinforcements have poor timing," Thomas told him grimly, securing the door with its heavy wooden bar. "Now they risk hitting you with their fire." Outside, men's voices called to each other, coordinating their approach. Thomas counted 4 distinct tones. Sullivan's estimate had been accurate. He moved to the window, risking a quick glance outside. The attackers were spreading out, using the trees for cover as they advanced on the cabin from multiple angles. Their movements were disciplined, suggesting military experience. One man, distinguished by a black duster and wide-brimmed hat, directed the others with hand signals from behind a large boulder. Thomas assessed his options, none of them favorable. The Winchester rifle offered 6 shots, not enough for a prolonged firefight. The cabin's sturdy construction would provide temporary protection, but Fletcher's men would eventually either rush the door or smoke them out. A bullet splintered the shutter, narrowly missing Thomas as he ducked away from the window. The shooters were finding their range. Time was running short. Thomas made his decision. Moving to the stone fireplace, he dislodged a loose brick near the hearth, revealing a small cavity. From it, he extracted a leather pouch containing flint, steel, and several small bundles wrapped in waxed cloth, similar to the distractions he had used against Sullivan and the Chambers brothers, but larger. Sullivan watched with widening eyes as Thomas methodically arranged the bundles near the cabin's single window and door. Understanding dawned on his face, replaced quickly by panic. "You're blowing the whole place," he mumbled through his gag, renewed desperation in his struggles. Beside him, the Chambers brothers began their own frantic attempts to free themselves, the travois rocking with their efforts. Thomas ignored them, continuing his preparations. When each bundle was positioned to his satisfaction, he retrieved a small clay pot from a high shelf. Inside was a thick, resinous substance that he applied sparingly to the bindings of each bundle, connecting them with a thin trail. Outside, the attackers had ceased firing, likely conserving ammunition while they plotted their final assault. Thomas heard the crunch of boots on gravel as they closed in on the cabin from all sides. "Last chance, Sullivan," the man in the black duster called from beyond the door. "Tell your Indian friend to surrender the girl and the map. Nobody else needs to die today." Thomas removed Sullivan's gag, allowing him to respond. The guide wet his cracked lips, a calculating gleam entering his eyes. "Fletcher," he called back, "the Indian's rigging explosives. He's going to blow the cabin with us inside." A tense silence followed this revelation, broken by Fletcher's measured response. "That seems unwise for all concerned. Perhaps we can negotiate." Thomas replaced Sullivan's gag, despite the man's protests. "There is nothing to negotiate," he called through the door. "Leave now, and you may live." Fletcher's laugh carried clearly through the wooden walls. "Bold words from a cornered man, but I admire courage." A pause. "Tell me, what's your name, friend, so I can mark your grave properly?" "Thomas Blackfeather," he answered, continuing his preparations without haste. The name produced a noticeable silence outside. Thomas had anticipated this. His reputation among both settlers and tribes of the region was substantial. First as a scout for the army during early campaigns, later as a renowned tracker and occasional enforcer of frontier justice. Black Feather, Fletcher repeated finally. Well now, that changes matters somewhat. I've heard stories about you. They say you single-handedly tracked the McCready gang across 3 territories after they raided your village. Thomas said nothing, checking the Winchester's action one final time. They also say you left their bodies hanging from cottonwoods as a message, Fletcher continued. Quite effective, as I recall. Raids decreased significantly afterward. When Thomas remained silent, Fletcher changed tactics. Look, Blackfeather, we're both reasonable men. What's your stake in this? The girl? The map? Name your price. Justice, Thomas replied simply, for 21 murdered settlers. Fletcher's sigh was audible even through the door. Justice is a luxury on the frontier, my friend. Gold is the only currency that matters. His voice hardened. Sullivan, Chambers, and their associate performed a service. Unfortunate, but necessary. That map represents millions in untapped wealth. Surely you can appreciate the economics involved. Thomas moved to the door, standing beside it rather than in front. I understand perfectly, he called back. You're a murderer who uses others to keep his hands clean. Harsh words, Fletcher responded, his tone suggesting he was unmoved by the accusation. But irrelevant now. We have the girl. She's being brought to me as we speak. Thomas felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. Fletcher was bluffing. Rebecca had escaped on Shadow, heading east as instructed. The horse knew these woods and would follow the creek to safety even if Rebecca couldn't guide him. You lie, he said flatly. Do. Fletcher's voice carried a smirk. Sure, bring our guest forward. A moment of silence, then a new voice. Female, trembling but defiant. Thomas, don't listen to them. I got away, but they... The voice cut off abruptly, replaced by Fletcher's smooth tones. Now you see our position more clearly. Surrender the map and yourself, and the girl lives. Otherwise... He let the implication hang. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, recentering himself. Rebecca's capture changed everything and nothing. Fletcher would kill them all regardless of any surrender. The map was too valuable, the witnesses too dangerous to his operation. I need proof she's unharmed, Thomas called, playing for time as he mentally recalculated his strategy. Reasonable, Fletcher agreed. Sure, bring the girl closer. Where? Our friend can see her. Thomas risked a glance through a crack in the shutters. A burly man with a scar distorting his left eye pushed Rebecca forward into the clearing before the cabin. Her hands were bound behind her, and a bruise darkened her cheek, but she stood straight, her eyes flashing with anger rather than fear. Shadow was nowhere in sight, either escaped or captured elsewhere. Satisfied? Fletcher called. Thomas withdrew from the window, mind racing. The odds had worsened, but not insurmountably. Fletcher's men would be more cautious now with Rebecca as leverage, less likely to rush the cabin or set it ablaze. Release her first, Thomas demanded. Then we'll discuss terms. Fletcher laughed. That's not how this works, Blackfeather. The map first, then we'll talk about the girl. Thomas made a swift decision. The map is with me, he lied. I'll bring it out. No weapons, just me and the map. A pause as Fletcher considered this offer. Very well, he said finally. Unarmed, hands visible. Any tricks and the girl dies immediately. Thomas turned to the bound men on the travois. All 3 watched him with a mixture of hope and suspicion. He knelt beside Sullivan, removing his gag once more. I'm leaving, he told the guide quietly. What happens next depends on you. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Thomas gestured to the bundles positioned around the cabin. Those contain enough powder to collapse this roof. The fuse burns for 2 minutes. He patted Sullivan's shoulder almost gently. If Fletcher honors his word, I'll return to free you. If not, he let the implication hang. You can't do this, Sullivan hissed, panic edging his voice. Fletcher will kill you the moment you step outside. Perhaps, Thomas acknowledged, rising to his feet, but he will not expect what follows. Before Sullivan could respond, Thomas replaced his gag and moved to the door. He took a moment to center himself, drawing on the stillness his grandfather had taught him, the calm at the heart of the storm. Then he unbarred the door and stepped into the sunlight, hands raised and empty. Fletcher stood 20 paces away, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His black duster hung open, revealing an expensive brocade vest and the gleam of a gold watch chain. The revolver in his hand was similarly ornate, engraved silver, catching the morning light. Thomas Blackfeather, Fletcher said, as if greeting an expected guest. At last we meet. Your reputation precedes you. Thomas remained silent, scanning the clearing. 2 men flanked Fletcher, rifles ready. The fourth, Shaw presumably, stood behind Rebecca, a knife held casually near her throat. Shadow was indeed nowhere to be seen, likely secured beyond the ridge. The map, Fletcher prompted, gesturing with his revolver. Release the girl first, Thomas countered. Fletcher's smile didn't reach his eyes. You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Blackfeather. Neither are you, Thomas replied evenly. The map isn't on my person. It's hidden nearby. The girl can lead you to it after I'm gone. This was a gamble, but Thomas was counting on Fletcher's greed outweighing his caution. The judge hesitated, weighing the claim. An interesting proposition, Fletcher said finally, but incomplete. Sullivan and the Chambers brothers, they remain at a loose end. They're secured inside, Thomas answered, unconscious from our disagreement earlier. Another lie, but a necessary one. Fletcher seemed to accept this, nodding thoughtfully. Very well, a compromise then. Shaw will release the girl. You will tell her where to find the map. She retrieves it while you remain with us. Once we have the map, you both are free to go. His smile widened, assuming the map leads to Blackwater as promised. It was a better offer than Thomas had expected, which immediately raised his suspicions. Fletcher had no intention of letting either of them leave alive. This was merely a strategy to secure the map with minimum risk to his men. Thomas met Rebecca's gaze across the clearing. Her eyes conveyed a clear message. Don't trust them, but they also held something else, determination and a hint of calculation. She had a plan of her own. Agreed, Thomas said, lowering his hand slightly. But the girl comes to me first, so I can tell her where to look. Fletcher considered this, then nodded to Shaw. Release her, but stay close. The scarred man removed his knife from Rebecca's throat, slicing through the ropes binding her wrists. She stumbled forward, rubbing circulation back into her hands as she approached Thomas. Shaw followed 2 paces behind, hand resting on his holstered pistol. When Rebecca reached Thomas, her voice was barely a whisper. Shadow bolted. They caught me crossing the meadow. Thomas nodded almost imperceptibly. When I move, run for the trees, he murmured, pretending to point toward the forest, as if giving directions to the map's location. Rebecca's slight nod confirmed her understanding. Thomas raised his voice for Fletcher's benefit. The hollow oak by the creek split, behind the 3rd stone from the base. Got it, Rebecca said clearly, maintaining the charade. Fletcher's impatience was growing visible. Enough whispering, girl. Get the map. Shaw, accompany her. That wasn't our arrangement, Thomas objected. She goes alone. Plans change, Fletcher said dismissively. Shaw, go. As the scarred man moved to grab Rebecca's arm, Thomas made his move. In one fluid motion, he extracted a knife from its hidden sheath at the small of his back, the one place Fletcher's men hadn't thought to check on a supposedly unarmed man. The blade caught the sunlight as it flew, burying itself in Shaw's shoulder. The man howled, stumbling backward. Thomas shoved Rebecca toward the tree line, spinning to face the remaining threats. "Run!" he shouted, dropping to one knee as Fletcher and his men raised their weapons. Gunfire erupted, bullets kicking up dirt around Thomas as he rolled behind the meager cover of a water trough. Rebecca sprinted for the forest, zigzagging as Fletcher bellowed orders to his men. "Get the girl. The map's all that matters." Two of the men broke off, charging after Rebecca. Fletcher and the third man, a wiry individual with a cavalry carbine, advanced on Thomas's position, firing methodically to keep him pinned down. Thomas waited for a pause in the shooting, then risked a glance around the trough. Fletcher was 15 paces away, closing steadily. The judge's confident expression suggested he believed victory was moments away. "A valiant effort, Blackfeather," Fletcher called, "but ultimately futile." Thomas smiled for the first time that day, a predator's smile that stopped Fletcher in his tracks. "Is it?" he asked, reaching into his pocket. From it, he extracted a small object that gleamed in the sunlight. Flint and steel, struck together to produce a shower of sparks. These ignited a short fuse trailing from his pocket into the cabin behind him. Fletcher's eyes widened in sudden understanding. "Get back!" he shouted to his remaining man. "He's lit!" The explosion cut off his words, a concussive wave that shattered the cabin's window and blew its door off its hinges. Unlike the controlled distractions Thomas had used earlier, this blast contained genuine power, enough to fill the cabin with smoke and flame while sending debris flying across the clearing. Thomas used the chaos to sprint toward the forest, opposite the direction Rebecca had taken. As he'd hoped, Fletcher and his man instinctively pursued him, rather than continuing after Rebecca. "Kill him!" Fletcher's enraged voice carried over the ringing in Thomas's ears. $1,000 to whoever brings me his head." Thomas plunged into the trees, moving with the sure-footed speed of a man on familiar ground. Behind him, Sullivan and the Chambers brothers would be panicking in the smoke-filled cabin, alive but thoroughly convinced of their imminent demise. The explosive bundles had been largely for show, containing just enough powder to create a convincing blast without bringing down the roof. It was a desperate gambit, but it had achieved its primary goal, separating Fletcher's forces and creating confusion. Now Thomas needed to eliminate the pursuers and circle back to find Rebecca before the men chasing her could succeed in their task. The pursuit through the forest became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Thomas used every trick his father and grandfather had taught him, doubling back, crossing streams to mask his scent and tracks, laying false trails. Fletcher's men were skilled, but they were in Thomas Blackfeather's territory now, a realm where every tree and stone was an ally to the Crow warrior who had made these mountains his sanctuary. One by one, Thomas isolated and neutralized his pursuers. The first fell to a snare that left him dangling helplessly from a pine bough, his weapons claimed by Thomas before he continued on. The second walked into a carefully planned ambush, struck unconscious by a rock-weighted branch Thomas had rigged to swing when a tripwire was disturbed. Fletcher proved more challenging. The judge moved with the caution of a man accustomed to dangerous situations, avoiding the obvious traps Thomas had laid. Their pursuit stretched into hours, a test of endurance as much as skill. By midday, Thomas had led Fletcher deep into the mountains, far from the original confrontation. The judge's fine clothes were torn and muddied, his silver-streaked hair wild from pushing through brambles. Yet he maintained his composure, stalking his quarry with grim determination. "I know these tactics, Blackfeather," Fletcher called during a lull in their deadly dance. "I fought Apaches in Arizona before you were born. Your tricks won't work." "On me," Thomas remained silent, watching from the concealment of a dense thicket as Fletcher paused in a small clearing, revolver ready. The judge was right. He was too experienced to fall for simple ambushes. This would require a direct confrontation. Reaching a decision, Thomas emerged from cover, the Winchester rifle held casually at his side. Fletcher spun, weapon raised, but held his fire when he registered Thomas's deliberate exposure. "Finally tired of running?" Fletcher asked, maintaining his aim. "This ends here," Thomas replied. "One way or another." Fletcher's laugh held genuine amusement. "I admire your spirit, Blackfeather. It's a pity we find ourselves opposed." He gestured with his free hand, encompassing the forest around them. "You've led me quite a chase. My men—" "Incapacitated," Thomas answered. "Not dead, unless you abandoned them to the elements." "Consider you," Fletcher remarked, a hint of genuine approval in his tone. "Most would have killed them outright." "I'm not most men." "No," Fletcher agreed. "You're not. Which makes me wonder why you've involved yourself in this affair." "The girl? She's pretty enough, I suppose, though hardly worth dying for." "Justice," Thomas repeated his earlier answer. Fletcher sighed, lowering his revolver slightly, though Thomas noted it remained aimed in his general direction. "Justice," he echoed. "A noble concept, but impractical in these territories. Do you know how many settlers die crossing to Oregon each year? How many wagon trains are lost to disease, accident, or violence?" "This wasn't disease or accident," Thomas countered. "It was a calculated murder for profit." "Yes," Fletcher acknowledged without a hint of remorse. "Regrettable, but necessary. Blackwater represents wealth beyond imagining, enough to build cities, railways, foundations of civilization. In this wilderness, the few must sometimes be sacrificed for the many. Convenient philosophy," Thomas observed, "particularly when you decide who constitutes the few." Fletcher's expression hardened. "Enough philosophy. Where is the map, Blackfeather? The girl will be caught soon, if she hasn't been already. Tell me now, and perhaps I'll be merciful." Thomas's silence was enough. Fletcher raised his revolver to firing position. "A shame," the judge said. "You could have been an asset in the territory's development." Before he could pull the trigger, a shot cracked through the forest. Fletcher staggered, his revolver discharging harmlessly into the ground as he clutched his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, his face contorted with shock and pain. Rebecca stepped from behind a massive pine 30 yards away, the cavalry pistol Thomas had given her still raised and steady. Her face was scratched from brambles, her clothing torn, but her eyes were clear and determined. "That's for my father," she said, voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "And for all the others you murdered." Fletcher's expression cycled through shock, rage, and finally calculation as he assessed this new threat. Despite his wound, he began to raise his revolver again, directing it toward Rebecca. Thomas moved with the speed that had made his name, feared throughout the territory. Before Fletcher could level his weapon, Thomas closed the distance between them, the butt of the Winchester connecting solidly with the judge's temple. Fletcher collapsed without a sound, blood from his shoulder, wound staining the forest floor. Rebecca approached cautiously, the pistol still raised. "Is he—" "Unconscious," Thomas confirmed, checking Fletcher's pulse, "but alive." "The others—" "Subdued," Thomas assured her. "How did you find us?" A hint of pride showed through Rebecca's exhaustion. "I tracked you, followed the signs like you, showed me with the travois, broken branches, disturbed earth." She gestured to the cavalry pistol. "2 men followed me. I lost one in the creek, the other—" She swallowed. "I had to shoot him. In the leg. I left him tied to a tree." Thomas studied her with newfound respect. 3 days ago, Rebecca Ainsworth had been a terrified survivor hiding in a hollow log. Now she stood before him, having tracked a crow scout through difficult terrain and outmaneuvered trained killers. "You learn quickly," he said, the simplicity of the statement belying its significance. Rebecca's smile was weary but genuine. "Good teacher." Together, they secured Fletcher with strips cut from his own fine coat. The judge would live to stand trial if justice could penetrate the armor of wealth and influence he had built around himself. "What now?" Rebecca asked as they began the journey back toward the cabin, Fletcher's unconscious form slung across Thomas's shoulders. Thomas considered the question. Sullivan and the Chambers brothers would still be in the cabin, believing themselves moments from death. Fletcher's men were incapacitated, but would eventually free themselves if not collected. And the map, the catalyst for so much bloodshed, remained, hidden in Rebecca's locket. "Now," he said, "we face a greater threat than Fletcher and his men." Rebecca frowned. "What do you mean?" "The law," Thomas answered grimly. "Your word against a territorial judges, 3 white killers against a Crow warrior, and a girl with a dubious claim about a gold map." Understanding dawned in Rebecca's eyes. "They won't believe us," she said, voicing the harsh reality of frontier justice, "even with the map as evidence." "Not in Providence," Thomas agreed. "Fletcher's influence runs too deep there." "Then where?" Rebecca pressed. "We can't just let them go free after what they've done." Thomas adjusted Fletcher's weight across his shoulders, his decision crystallizing. "Fort Laramie," he said. 2 days' hard ride south. Army jurisdiction, outside Fletcher's immediate influence. Colonel Harrington commands there. A hard man, but honest." Rebecca nodded slowly, processing this change in plans. "Will he believe us?" "He'll believe evidence," Thomas replied, "and we have that in abundance." As they continued through the forest, the full scope of the threat they faced became increasingly clear. Fletcher represented not just a single corrupt official, but an entire system designed to favor certain interests over others. Justice for 21 murdered settlers would require confronting that system directly, a dangerous proposition for a Crow warrior with a complicated past and a young woman with no family or connections. Yet, in that moment, picking their way through the wilderness with an unconscious judge as their prisoner, Thomas Blackfeather and Rebecca Ainsworth found themselves united by a common purpose stronger than the danger surrounding them. The wooden sparrow still rested in Rebecca's pocket, a reminder that sometimes lost souls found unexpected guides on their journey home, and sometimes those guides led to paths neither could have anticipated. The tribunal panel, consisting of Colonel Harrington and 2 other officers, sat at a table facing a now empty prisoner's dock. Thomas stood to one side, accompanied by Swift Fox and many horses. Their presence, respected tribal representatives rather than guards, signaled a significant shift in Thomas's status. "Miss Rebecca Ainsworth," Colonel Harrington announced as she approached, "sole survivor of the Wilson Creek Wagon Train Massacre and key witness against Judge Harrison Fletcher, Micah Sullivan, and Ethan and Levi Chambers." Rebecca halted before the tribunal, intensely aware of Thomas watching her from his position with the Crow representatives. His expression revealed nothing to casual observers, but she recognized the subtle softening around his eyes that constituted profound emotion for him. "Miss Ainsworth," Harrington continued, "your allegations against Judge Fletcher have been substantiated by separate confessions from Sullivan and both Chambers brothers, each believing the others had already betrayed them." A grim smile briefly touched his lips, an old interrogation technique but effective. Relief weakened Rebecca's knees, but she remained standing tall. "And Fletcher, in custody, charged with conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to multiple homicides, attempted murder, corruption of office, and various lesser crimes." Harrington's tone was matter-of-fact, but satisfaction gleamed in his eyes. His influential friends may attempt to intervene, but 21 murdered settlers, including women and children, will be difficult to explain away, especially with 3 accomplices providing testimony. Rebecca nodded, processing this information. Justice for her father and the others suddenly seemed possible, not certain, but within reach. "Thank you, Colonel." "Don't thank me," Harrington replied. "Thank Blackfeather," His reputation with this fort, earned at Black Horse Canyon and a dozen other engagements, gave your claims the credibility needed to investigate properly. He glanced at Thomas with unmistakable respect. Some debts can never be fully repaid. The formal proceedings concluded shortly thereafter, with Harrington promising to expedite transfer of Fletcher and his accomplices to territorial authorities. Rebecca found herself suddenly unmoored. The single-minded purpose that had driven her since the massacre, survival, then justice, now fulfilled, leaving her future a blank canvas. As the yard cleared, Thomas approached with Swift Fox beside him. Seeing them together, Rebecca noted the resemblance, the same high cheekbones and watchful eyes, though Swift Fox's features carried less of the hardness that years of isolation had etched into her brother's face. "You succeeded," Thomas said simply, the understatement typical of his restrained manner. Rebecca managed a tired smile. "We succeeded," she corrected. "I would have died in that forest without you." Swift Fox studied Rebecca with frank curiosity. "My brother rarely involves himself in settler affairs," she observed. "You must be special indeed to have earned such intervention." Before Rebecca could respond to this unexpected assessment, Colonel Harrington rejoined them, accompanied by many horses. "Miss Ainsworth, temporary quarters have been arranged for you within the fort," the colonel informed her. "You'll be comfortable there while we sort out the legal formalities and determine your path forward." The practical consideration of her future landed heavily. Rebecca had been so focused on reaching Fort Laramie and securing justice that she hadn't truly contemplated what would come after. Her father was gone, their Oregon plans destroyed, her entire life uprooted. She had no family remaining in Pennsylvania, no connections in this territory. "Thank you, Colonel," she replied automatically, the uncertainty of her situation suddenly overwhelming. Many horses, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, spoke for the first time. "The girl carries herself with dignity," he observed to no one in particular. "She has survived what would break many warriors." Swift Fox nodded agreement. "The spirits guided my brother well when he found her tracks. This conversation about her, conducted as if she weren't present, might once have offended Rebecca. Now, she recognized it as evaluation rather than dismissal. These people were assessing her worth by criteria very different from those she had grown up with in Pennsylvania society. Thomas seemed to sense her discomfort. "You should rest," he advised. "The coming days will require further testimony as Fletcher's case proceeds to the territorial court." Rebecca nodded, suddenly aware of how bone-deep her exhaustion had become. The lieutenant who had escorted her earlier reappeared to guide her to her quarters, a small but clean room with a proper bed, wash basin, and lamp. After weeks of wilderness survival and makeshift camps, such simple comforts seemed almost unimaginable luxury. "Mr. Blackfeather," she called, as Thomas turned to leave with his sister and many horses. "Will I see you tomorrow?" Something flickered in Thomas's expression, uncertainty perhaps, or some deeper emotion she couldn't name. "Yes," he answered finally. "We have much to discuss." That night, Rebecca slept deeply for the first time since the massacre, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion now that immediate danger had passed. She woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the distant sounds of fort life, soldiers drilling, horses in the stable, the rhythmic chopping of firewood. A knock at her door revealed a young woman in a simple dress bearing a tray with bread, preserves, and coffee. "Colonel's compliments, miss," she said, placing the tray on the small table beside the bed. "He asks that you join him in his office at your convenience this morning." Rebecca thanked her, grateful for both the meal and the lack of pressure to appear immediately. She took time to wash properly and arrange her hair, donning the clean dress Swift Fox had somehow procured for her, a simple garment of undyed cotton, but blessedly free of the tears, bloodstains, and grime that had marked her own clothing. Colonel Harrington's office was busy when she arrived, officers coming and going with reports and requisitions. Yet the commander made time for her immediately, dismissing his adjutant to provide privacy for their conversation. "Miss Ainsworth," he greeted her, gesturing to a chair. "I trust you rested well." "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted, taking the offered seat. "Thank you for your hospitality." Harrington waved away her gratitude. "The least we could do, considering the circumstances." He leaned forward, hands clasped on his desk. "I wanted to discuss your future plans, now that Fletcher's case is proceeding to proper authorities." The directness of his approach was startling, but not unwelcome. "To be honest, Colonel, I haven't had the opportunity to consider my options fully." "Understandable," he acknowledged. "However, certain practical matters require attention. The land claim your father purchased in Oregon Territory, for instance, as his sole heir, you're entitled to take possession. The Army could arrange an escort with the next supply convoy heading west, departing in 2 weeks. Rebecca considered this possibility. The Oregon settlement had been her father's dream, not hers, a place where Samuel Ainsworth envisioned building a legacy through his sawmill. Without him, without the other families who would have formed their community, the prospect held little appeal. "Alternatively," Harrington continued when she didn't immediately respond, "my wife has suggested you might consider remaining in this region. Several respectable families in Laramie Town would welcome a young woman of your background as governess or companion." This option, while practical, struck Rebecca as equally uninspiring. The thought of retreating into the confined propriety of settler society after all she had experienced felt like surrendering something vital, something she had discovered about herself in the wilderness. "You're very kind," she said carefully, "but I'm not certain either path feels right at present." Harrington nodded, unsurprised. "Blackfeather suggested you might say something of the sort." A hint of amusement touched his expression. "He also mentioned something about a gold claim." Rebecca's hand moved involuntarily to the locket around her neck, which now contained only her mother's portrait, the map having been submitted as evidence. "Blackwater," she confirmed. "The reason for the massacre." The territorial assayer reviewed the map evidence, Harrington informed her. "His preliminary assessment suggests it's genuine, a substantial deposit in a previously unexplored canyon. As Samuel Ainsworth's heir, that claim would legally be yours once properly registered." This revelation stunned Rebecca. In the chaos of pursuing justice, she had given little thought to the map's actual value beyond its evidentiary significance. "Mine?" With some complications, Harrington qualified. "Mining requires capital, labor, equipment. A young woman alone would find it challenging to develop such a claim without partners or substantial resources." Rebecca absorbed this information, mind racing with implications. The Blackwater claim represented wealth, potentially enough to fund whatever future she chose to create, independent of marriage prospects or employment positions. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "Of course," Harrington agreed, rising, to indicate their meeting was concluding, "though I should mention one other matter. Blackfeather has requested permission to leave the fort this afternoon to show you something he considers important. I've approved a day's absence for both of you, with escort to the fort perimeter." Curiosity immediately overtook Rebecca's other concerns. "Did he say what this was about?" "Blackfeather rarely explains himself fully," Harrington said with a slight smile. "But I've learned to trust his judgment. He'll meet you at the eastern gate at noon, if you're amenable." The autumn sun stood high when Rebecca arrived at the designated meeting place. Thomas waited beside Shadow, the Mustang apparently having found its way back to its master after their separation before Fort Laramie. Another horse, a sturdy chestnut mare, stood saddled nearby. "You're leaving the fort?" Rebecca asked as she approached, noting Thomas's preparations. He nodded. "With permission. There's something you should see before making decisions about. Your future. The mystery intrigued her. What sort of something? Better shown than explained, he replied, helping her mount the chestnut mare. It's a half-day's ride. We'll return by nightfall. They rode eastward from the fort, initially following the Laramie River, before turning north into rolling hills, covered with golden autumn grasses. Thomas maintained silence for much of the journey, but it was a comfortable quiet rather than the wary distance that had characterized their early interactions. By mid-afternoon, they crested a ridge that revealed a small valley nestled between protective hills. A clear creek meandered through its center, bordered by cottonwoods and willows, displaying the brilliant yellow of fall foliage. Near the water stood a cabin, larger than Thomas's mountain dwelling, sturdily constructed of pine logs with a stone. "Un chimney. What is this place?" Rebecca asked as they descended toward the structure. "Carson's Crossing," Thomas replied, "named for the trapper who built that cabin 10 winters ago. Jacob Carson died last spring. No family, no heirs. The property sits unclaimed." As they approached, Rebecca noted the cabin's good condition despite its apparent abandonment. The corrals and outbuildings needed minor repairs, but the main structure remained sound, its construction practical but comfortable by frontier standards. Thomas dismounted, tethering Shadow to a hitching post before helping Rebecca from her horse. "Carson was a friend," he explained, leading her toward the cabin. "I checked on him when passing between territories. Found him peaceful in his bed when spring came." The cabin's interior was simple but thoughtfully arranged. A main room with fireplace, table and chairs, a separate sleeping area partitioned by a half wall, shelves for provisions, and windows positioned to catch both morning and afternoon light. Carson's personal belongings had been removed, presumably by Thomas, leaving the space clean but barren of individual character. "Why show me this?" Rebecca asked, running her hand along the smooth, planed surface of the table. Thomas moved to the window, looking out over the valley. Carson's Crossing sits at the junction of 3 trails, the northern route to Oregon, the path to Montana mining territories, and an eastern track connecting to the main emigrant road. This valley has water year-round, good grazing, shelter from winter storms. Understanding began to dawn. A natural stopping point for travelers. Exactly. Thomas turned to face her. Jacob used to offer shelter, fresh supplies, information about conditions ahead. Saved many lives during his years here, though few outside the territory knew his name. Rebecca circled the room slowly, mind filling the empty space with possibilities. A larger table where exhausted travelers could share meals and information. Shelves stocked with essential supplies. Perhaps a separate building where the ill or injured could recover before continuing their journeys. Carson had no children, Thomas continued, no wife. His last request was that his home serve a purpose after his passing. "You're suggesting," Rebecca began, hesitant to voice the thought taking shape. "The Blackwater claim could purchase this property from the Territorial Land Office legitimately," Thomas said, confirming her unspoken realization. "Establish something permanent, a haven between settlements where travelers find more than commerce, find knowledge, safety, compassion." The vision resonated deeply with Rebecca. In this valley, she could honor her father's westward ambitions while creating something uniquely meaningful, a place that might prevent other families from suffering the fate of her wagon train. A significant undertaking for a woman alone, she observed, echoing concerns Harrington had raised about the mining claim. Thomas met her gaze directly, something uncharacteristically vulnerable in his expression. "You wouldn't need to be alone." The simple statement hung between them, its implication profound. Rebecca studied Thomas Blackfeather, this complex man who had found her tracks in the forest, taught her to survive, risked everything to help her achieve justice. In his face, still guarded but increasingly familiar, she saw a possibility, neither. of them had anticipated when their paths first crossed. "What exactly are you proposing, Thomas Blackfeather?" she asked softly. He moved closer, his usual reserve giving way to careful honesty. "For 3 years I've existed rather than lived, carrying grief like a stone in my chest. My sister calls it a slow death." His gaze remained steady on hers. "You woke up to something I thought lost. Purpose beyond survival, beyond memory. Coming." From Thomas, this amounted to a profound personal revelation. Rebecca recognized its significance, not just the content, but the fact of its expression. "A partnership," he continued when she remained silent. "Your knowledge of settlers needs my understanding of the land. Your compassion, my protection. Building something neither of us could create alone." "And what of your cabin in the mountains?" Rebecca asked, knowing how deeply Thomas valued his solitude. "It remains," he answered simply. "A retreat when needed, a hunting camp in season, but no longer my only home." The proposition was unconventional by any standard, neither a traditional marriage proposal nor a mere business arrangement, but something unique to their shared experiences and individual needs. It acknowledged the bond forged between them, while respecting the independence each had fought to maintain. Rebecca moved to the doorway, looking out over Carson's Crossing with new eyes. In this valley, she could see not just what existed, but what might be created. A sanctuary for travelers, a place of genuine help rather than mere commerce, a legacy more meaningful than the sawmill her father had envisioned. "It would require work," she said, thinking aloud. "Repairs to the outbuildings, expansion of the garden plot, perhaps a separate structure for healing the ill or injured." Thomas's expression lightened at her practical consideration rather than immediate rejection. "The crow often winter in the sheltered valley 10 miles north," he offered. "Many would trade labor for supplies or shelter. Swift Fox has knowledge of healing plants that surpasses even my grandmother's teachings." The pieces began to align. In Rebecca's mind, not a complete plan, but the framework for one. The Blackwater claim could provide financial foundation, Carson's Crossing the physical location, their combined skills and experiences the human element necessary for success. "And when travelers ask about us," Rebecca questioned, addressing a practical concern. "A white woman and a Crow warrior operating such an establishment together will raise questions." Thomas considered this. "We tell them the truth," he said finally, "that we survived tragedy separately, found strength together, and built something new from what remained." He paused, adding with rare humor, "Or we tell them to mind their own business and be grateful for fresh bread and accurate trail information." Rebecca laughed, a genuine, unburdened sound that surprised her with its freedom. In that moment, she recognized how far she had come from the terrified girl hiding beneath a fallen pine. The Rebecca Ainsworth, who had set out for Oregon with her father, might have balked at such an unconventional proposal, constrained by societal expectations and limited understanding of her own capabilities. But the woman who had survived a massacre, tracked killers through the wilderness, and faced down a territorial judge was someone entirely different, someone who recognized value beyond convention and strength in unexpected places. "Yes," she said simply, Thomas's brow furrowed. "Yes, to which part?" "To all of it," Rebecca clarified, stepping closer to him. "To Carson's Crossing, to the partnership you've proposed, to building something that honors those we've lost by helping, those still journeying." The transformation in Thomas's expression was subtle but profound, the rigid control he maintained, giving way momentarily to genuine emotion that softened the lines grief had carved into his features. He didn't move to embrace her or make dramatic declarations. Instead, he extended his hand in the traditional gesture of an agreement sealed between equals. Rebecca took it without hesitation, their clasp firm and purposeful, a frontier handshake, binding a promise between two survivors who had found unexpected connection in the aftermath of tragedy. Carson's Crossing, she said, testing the name, though perhaps it needs a new designation to mark its new purpose. Thomas considered this. Ainsworth Haven, he suggested quietly. The honor to her father brought unexpected tears to Rebecca's eyes. Or Blackfeather Sanctuary, she countered, for the man who followed my tracks when no one else would have bothered. In the end, they settled on simply The Crossing, a name that acknowledged the property's history while embracing its future as a place where travelers might safely cross from one phase of their journey to another, much as Rebecca and Thomas had crossed from isolation to partnership, from grief to purpose. As they rode back toward Fort Laramie in the golden light of late afternoon, Rebecca felt the wooden sparrow Thomas had given her still nestled in her pocket. His son had believed sparrows guided lost souls home, a sentiment that had seemed merely poetic when Thomas first shared it. Now, as they crested the final ridge with the fort visible in the distance, the carved bird felt like a fulfilled promise. The journey ahead would not be easy. Establishing the crossing would require labor, patience, and courage. The territorial authorities might still falter in delivering justice to Fletcher and his accomplices. The social complications of their unconventional partnership would certainly arise in various forms. Yet in that moment, watching Thomas Blackfeather ride beside her, this wounded protector who had found new purpose just as she had, Rebecca, Ainsworth felt something she had not expected to experience again after watching her father's wagon train burn. Hope, not the naive optimism of her former life, but something more resilient, a tempered hope forged in survival, strengthened through justice, and now directed toward creating sanctuary in a harsh land. The sole survivor of a wagon massacre had found her way forward, guided by the most unlikely of companions, a Crow warrior who had followed her tracks when they seemed destined to disappear forever into the wilderness. Some trails, Rebecca reflected, as Fort Laramie's gates opened to receive them, led to destinations no map could predict and no pioneer had charted. The wisdom lay in recognizing when to follow them nonetheless. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.